Settle in, friend. This is Olympus Dreams, where old stories quiet the mind. Tonight, we journey to a time when heroes were born not from choice, but from prophecy whispered in the dark, in the kingdom of Iolcus, where olive groves climbed gentle hills and the sea breathed salt against stone harbors. A child was born beneath a sky thick with stars. His name was Jason, and from the moment he drew his first breath, his life belonged to fate rather than to his parents. The midwives wrapped him in soft wool, their hands careful and quick, while outside the birthing chamber torches flickered in a wind that carried rumors of danger. His father, Aeson, was king, or had been, until his half-brother Peleus, hungry and impatient, had seized the throne through words sharp as blades and promises broken before they cooled. Aeson, too gentle for the cruelty politics demanded, had stepped aside. But a king's son, even a deposed king's son, was a threat. And Peleus understood threats the way wolves understand wounded deer. So before dawn could fully break, while the palace still hummed with celebration and exhaustion, Jason's mother wrapped him tighter and carried him through corridors she had walked as queen. Her feet knew every stone, every turn where shadows pooled deepest. She moved like water, silent and purposeful, until she reached a small door that opened onto the kitchen gardens. Beyond lay the forest. The trees received them without question. Oaks older than memory spread their branches overhead, filtering moonlight into silver patterns across the forest floor. The mother walked for hours, her son quiet against her chest, as if he understood the necessity of silence. Owls watched from high perches. Deer lifted their heads, then returned to grazing. The forest kept its own counsel and offered no betrayal. She followed a path that existed more in knowledge than in visible track, through groves where moss grew thick as carpet, past streams that sang over rounded stones, up slopes where pine trees whispered in languages the wind had taught them. Her destination had been chosen carefully, discussed in secret with those few advisors who had remained loyal to Aeson. There was only one place in all of Greece where a prince might be hidden and raised beyond the reach of ambitious kings. The cave of Chiron stood halfway up Mount Pelion, where the mountain met the sky in a marriage of stone and cloud. The centaur had lived there since time had learned to count itself, older than kingdoms, wiser than most gods, and patient in ways that mortals could barely comprehend. He was a teacher, a healer, and a keeper of secrets, and he had been expecting them. She found him standing at the cave entrance as the first birds began their morning songs, starlight caught in his kind eyes. His human torso rose from the strong body of a horse, and both parts moved with a grace that suggested music even in stillness. He did not speak. He simply stepped aside and gestured inward, where firelight painted warm colors across stone walls. The mother entered, exhausted beyond words. She laid Jason in Chiron's waiting arms, and the centaur cradled the child with the same careful attention he gave to the wounded birds he sometimes nursed back to flight. For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled. Somewhere deeper in the cave, water dripped with the patient rhythm of years passing. Finally, she found her voice. "Teach him," she said. "Teach him to be worthy of a crown he may never wear. Teach him strength and wisdom. Teach him mercy." Chiron nodded slowly. He had raised heroes before. Achilles, who would one day blaze across Troy like a falling star. Asclepius, who would become so skilled at healing that death itself grew jealous. He knew what it meant to shape a life toward destiny. And he knew the weight such shaping carried. She stayed until morning light began to filter through the cave mouth, turning everything soft and golden. Then she kissed her son's forehead, whispered a prayer to gods who might or might not listen, and walked back down the mountain path alone. She did not look back. Looking back would have shattered her, and so Jason remained. The cave became his home, and Chiron became father, teacher, and friend. The centaur's cave was not cold or bare as one might imagine. Herbs hung drying from the ceiling, filling the air with scents of thyme and lavender. Shelves carved into the rock held scrolls and stones marked with constellations. A small garden grew near the entrance where the sunlight reached, and Chiron tended it with careful hands, explaining to young Jason which plants healed wounds and which brought sleep, which could be eaten and which carried secrets in their roots. In those early years, Jason learned the language of silence. He watched how Chiron moved through daily tasks with deliberate grace, wasting nothing, hurrying nowhere. The centaur taught him to read the stars, to understand that each bright point had a name, a story, a place in the great turning of the heavens. They would sit outside on clear nights, and Chiron would point upward with one hand, while Jason followed the invisible lines connecting light to light. The seasons turned their ancient wheel. Spring arrived with flowers Jason learned to name by scent before sight: crocus, violet, narcissus, hyacinth. Each one blooming in its proper time, following laws older than kingdoms. Summer brought heat that made the pine trees release their resin into the air, sweet and thick. Jason would help Chiron gather healing plants during those long, bright days, his small hands learning to recognize leaf shapes and stem textures. Autumn painted the mountainside in colors that seemed impossible, as if the trees had borrowed fire from sunset itself. They collected nuts and prepared for winter, stacking wood, storing grain, making ready for the months when snow would seal them into quieter rhythms. And when winter came, white and silent, Jason learned patience by the fire, while Chiron told stories of gods and heroes, of mistakes made and prices paid, of glory that faded and kindness that endured. He grew as children do, marking time not in calendars, but in small victories. The day he could draw a bowstring all the way back. The evening he played a simple melody on a wooden flute without Chiron wincing. The morning he climbed to the highest ledge above the cave and saw the world spread beneath him, endless and waiting. Through it all, Chiron watched. He saw the boy's quick mind, his steady hands, his tendency toward compassion that would serve him better than any sword. And he saw something else, too. A quiet determination that had not been taught but simply was, like the color of his eyes or the rhythm of his breathing. Years accumulated like snowfall, silent and transforming. Jason grew tall. His shoulders broadened, his voice deepened. And one morning he woke before dawn and knew with certainty that could not be questioned that his time on the mountain was ending. He found Chiron already awake, sitting outside the cave, gazing toward the distant coast where Iolcus lay invisible beyond the horizon. The centaur turned his head slightly. "You feel it," he said. "Not a question." Jason nodded. "I do." Chiron was quiet for a time, watching as the sun began its slow climb over the eastern ridges. Then he spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of partings repeated across centuries. "I have taught you what I could. The rest you will teach yourself. Or the world will teach you. Sometimes they are the same." The morning unfolded with unusual stillness, as if the mountain itself were holding something precious in the cup of its silence. Jason moved through the cave, performing familiar tasks, rolling up his sleeping mat, stirring the embers of the fire. Setting water to heat in the clay pot Chiron had shaped with his own hands years before. But every gesture felt different now, weighted with the knowledge of departure, with the understanding that these simple acts would soon become memories rather than routine. Chiron prepared food without speaking, bread made from grain they had harvested together the previous autumn. Honey collected from hives that hummed in the valley below, wild berries that stained the fingers purple. They ate slowly, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable but full, like the pause between breaths when the body rests. After the meal, they walked. Not toward the summit where lessons in star reading had taken place, but down along the paths Jason had traveled countless times as a child. Now seeing them with eyes that understood, he was saying farewell. The moss that grew on the northern side of the oaks, the particular boulder where he had once skinned his knee and learned that pain passes but scars remain as teachers. the stream that had taught him patience when he tried to catch fish with his bare hands, failing for weeks before finally understanding the waiting stillness required. They stopped at the meadow where wildflowers grew in chaotic abundance. Chiron bent slowly, his horse body folding at the joints, and plucked a small blue flower Jason did not recognize. "This is called forget-me-not," the centaur said. His tone was soft. "It grows in places between things, between forest and field, between earth and water. Remember that most wisdom lives in such spaces, not in certainties, but in the questions that border them." Jason took the flower, turning it gently between his fingers. The petals were so delicate they seemed barely there at all. He tucked it carefully into his belt, where it would stay until the journey destroyed it or the years faded it away. They climbed back to the cave as afternoon stretched its long golden hands across the mountain. Chiron gathered supplies for the journey, a leather pack worn soft with age, a water skin sealed with beeswax, bread wrapped in clean linen, a small knife with a bone handle, and then, after some consideration, a cloak woven from wool so fine it might have been cloud stuff, dyed deep blue like evening sky. "Your mother left this," Chiron said. "She wanted you to have something that remembered her hands." Jason accepted it without words. He wrapped the cloak around his shoulders, and it settled there as if it had been waiting years to find its proper place. That night, they sat by the fire one last time. Chiron did not offer grand advice or prophetic warnings. Instead, he told stories Jason had heard before, familiar tales that had shaped his childhood. The story of Prometheus, who stole fire and paid forever for his compassion. The story of Orpheus, whose music could gentle stones but could not hold his beloved when she slipped away. The story of Daedalus, who built wings from ambition and feathers, and watched his son fall into the sea that still bears his name. Jason listened as he always had, but tonight he heard different meanings threading through the old words. These were not just stories. They were maps of possibility, warnings and encouragements woven together, lessons about the price of greatness and the value of simply being kind. When the fire burned low, Chiron spoke once more. "The world will offer you many things. Power, fame, glory, that poets sing about for generations. Do not refuse them if they come. But do not chase them either. Chase instead what feels true, even when truth is quieter than applause." Jason nodded. He wanted to say something profound, to offer gratitude equal to the gift of years, but words seemed small and insufficient. So instead he simply reached out and placed his hand on Chiron's arm, feeling the warmth of living flesh beneath his palm. The steady pulse that confirmed this was not a dream. They slept, or tried to. Jason lay awake watching shadows dance across the cave ceiling, listening to the mountain breathe. Before dawn, he rose. Chiron was already awake, standing at the cave entrance, silhouetted against the slowly lightening sky. They did not embrace. That was not the centaur's way. But they stood together for a moment, breathing the same cold air, watching the same stars fade into blue. Then Jason shouldered his pack, adjusted the cloak, and began walking down the mountain path. He did not run. He did not look back. The forest received him like an old friend, branches closing softly behind him as he descended through layers of morning mist that tasted of dew and distant possibilities. The path wound down through territory he knew well, but everything felt changed now, the same way familiar rooms look different when you know you are leaving them forever. He passed the clearing where he had practiced archery until his arms ached, the spring where Chiron had taught him to identify water plants by their roots, the flat stone where they had sat during thunderstorms, watching lightning write brief alphabets across dark clouds. The descent took hours. The sun rose higher, warming the air, burning away the mist until the forest stood clear and sharp around him. Birds called to one another in languages Jason had learned to recognize if not understand. A deer watched him from between the trees, unafraid, before turning and vanishing into green shadow. By midday, he reached lower elevations where the trees changed character. The high pines gave way to oak and ash. The underbrush grew thicker. And then, quite suddenly, he heard something he had almost forgotten, the sound of running water, but not the small streams of the upper mountain. This was a river, full and strong, singing over stones as it rushed toward the sea. He pushed through the last screen of branches and stopped. Before him stretched the river, wider than he had imagined, its current swift and dark. And there, on the far bank, stood an old woman. She was bent with age, wrapped in ragged cloth, and her eyes, when she looked up at him, were pale as fog. She called across the water in a voice that cracked with years. "Please," she said, "I need to cross. But the current is too strong, and my legs remember strength they no longer possess." Jason did not hesitate. He waded into the river, feeling the cold shock of it rise past his ankles, his knees, his waist. The current pulled at him insistently, but he had learned balance on mountain paths where one misstep meant falling. He reached the old woman and lifted her gently, surprised by how light she was, as if age had hollowed her bones to bird weight. She wrapped thin arms around his neck, and together they began the crossing. Halfway across, his foot slipped on a smooth stone, and he felt his sandal pulled away by the current. He watched it tumble downstream, a small brown thing swallowed quickly by rushing water. But he did not stop. He steadied himself and continued forward until they reached the far bank. He set the old woman down carefully. She looked at him with eyes that suddenly seemed less foggy, clearer and stranger than before. "You have a kind heart," she said. "That will serve you better than strength, though you will need both before your story ends." And then she smiled, and for just a moment her form seemed to shift, growing taller, more luminous. Jason blinked, and she was gone. Only the scent of wild roses remained in the air, sweet and impossible, in a season when such flowers did not bloom. He stood alone on the river bank, one foot bare, one still sandaled, water dripping from his clothing. He looked down at his mismatched feet and felt something stir in his chest. Not prophecy exactly, but recognition, as if this odd detail meant something, marked him somehow. Beyond the river, the land opened into farmland and distant roads. And somewhere beyond that, Iolcus waited, the city of his birth, the throne that should have been his father's. Jason adjusted his pack, tightened the blue cloak around his shoulders, and began walking toward his future with one bare foot pressing against the earth, and the other protected. Neither more nor less real than the other, both carrying him forward into whatever came next. The road to Iolcus stretched longer than Jason had imagined. The river lay behind him now, its voice fading into the general murmur of the wider world, and before him the land opened in ways the mountain never had. Fields spread out in careful patterns, divided by low stone walls that marked one farmer's labor from another's. Olive groves stood in silver-green rows, their ancient trunks twisted into shapes that suggested they had been arguing with the wind for generations. Jason walked steadily, his bare foot finding its own rhythm against packed earth and scattered pebbles. The asymmetry felt strange at first, one soul protected and one vulnerable, but gradually it became simply how he moved. The sun climbed higher, and the air grew warm enough that he loosened the blue cloak at his throat, though he did not remove it. The wool still carried faint traces of something he could not name. Perhaps the smoke from Chiron's hearth, or the particular quality of mountain air, or simply the accumulated weight of years spent becoming himself. He passed farmhouses where dogs barked lazily from shade, and chickens scratched at dust with methodical attention. An old man repairing a fence straightened to watch him pass, eyes lingering on the mismatched feet but saying nothing. A child carrying water from a well stopped to stare, then waved tentatively. Jason raised his hand in return, the gesture feeling formal and uncertain, like a word spoken in a language he was still learning. The land began to change as he traveled. The neat fields gave way to rougher ground where wild grasses grew tall and goats grazed in scattered groups. their bells making soft, irregular music. Oak trees appeared, standing alone or in small clusters, their branches spreading wide as if offering shelter to anything that might need it. Jason rested beneath one during the hottest part of the day, sharing his bread with ants that marched in purposeful lines across the gnarled roots. He thought about the old woman at the river. Her transformation, if that was what it had been, haunted the edges of his mind like a half-remembered dream. Chiron had spoken of the gods often, describing them not as distant abstractions, but as real presences that move through the world with purposes both vast and peculiar. Perhaps she had been one of them. Perhaps she had simply been an old woman who needed help, and the roses Jason smelled were wild ones blooming somewhere out of sight. It seemed important not to decide too quickly which was true. By late afternoon, he saw other travelers on the road. A merchant with a donkey loaded with clay jars passed, going the opposite direction, nodding companionably. Two women carrying baskets of vegetables walked together, their conversation pausing as Jason approached, resuming after he had moved beyond hearing. The world, it seemed, was full of people going about their ordinary business, and he was simply one more figure on a dusty road, remarkable only for his missing sandal. The first houses of Iolcus appeared as the sun began its descent toward evening. They started as scattered dwellings, simple structures of mud brick and thatch, then grew more numerous and substantial as the road led him deeper into settled land. Stone began to replace mud, and roofs showed the careful work of skilled hands. Gardens appeared behind low walls, and the smell of cooking fires drifted through the air, carrying scents of fish and herbs and bread. Jason had never seen a city before. Chiron had described them, of course, but description could not capture the sheer density of human presence. The way buildings crowded together, as if seeking one another's company, the narrow streets that wound between them like rivers finding their own courses. People moved everywhere, busy with purposes he could not guess. A woman hung wet cloth on a line to dry. Two men argued cheerfully over the price of rope. Children chased a dog that seemed to be enjoying the game more than they were. He walked deeper into the city, following the road as it climbed toward higher ground. The buildings grew more impressive, their walls painted white or pale yellow, their doorways framed with carved wood. And then, quite suddenly, the street opened into a broad plaza, and beyond it rose the palace of Iolcus. It was not as grand as Jason had imagined, but it possessed its own stern beauty. The walls were thick stone, built to last, and the gates stood open in the evening light, guarded by men wearing leather armor and carrying spears that caught the sun's last rays. Above the walls, Jason could see the upper levels of the palace itself, columns supporting a roof of dark tiles, windows like watching eyes. He stopped at the edge of the plaza, suddenly uncertain. He had come all this way with a purpose burning quietly in his heart, the knowledge that this place should have been his inheritance, that his father's throne had been stolen by his uncle's ambition. But standing here, looking at the palace where Pelias ruled, Jason felt the full weight of what he was about to do. He was one man, alone, with nothing but a blue cloak, a leather pack, and one missing sandal. What could he possibly say that would matter to a king? People in the plaza had begun to notice him. He saw heads turn, heard the subtle shift in conversation that meant he had become the subject of attention. It was the feet, of course. One bare, one sandaled. An oddity strange enough to mark him as something other than an ordinary traveler. One of the guards at the palace gate took a step forward, his hand tightening on his spear, not in threat, but in readiness. The man's face showed no hostility, only the careful watchfulness of someone whose job was to notice unusual things. Jason stood very still, gathering himself. The sun touched the horizon, painting the palace walls amber and gold. Somewhere inside, his uncle sat on a throne that did not belong to him, unaware that the child he had tried to erase was standing in his plaza. Breathing the same air, preparing to speak words that would change everything or nothing. He thought of Chiron's last lessons, the quiet emphasis on patience and timing. He thought of his mother's cloak, the blue wool that had traveled with him down the mountain. He thought of the old woman at the river, whoever or whatever she had been, and her words about kindness serving him better than strength. Then Jason took a breath, straightened his shoulders, and began walking toward the palace gates. The guard who had stepped forward did not move to block Jason's path, but his eyes never left the young man approaching with his strange, uneven gait. Jason could feel the weight of scrutiny pressing against him like a physical thing, the attention of soldiers trained to measure threat and intent in the span of a heartbeat. He kept his pace steady, neither hurried nor hesitant, letting his hands hang loosely at his sides where they could be seen. When he reached speaking distance, the guard raised one hand in a gesture that was almost polite. "Stop, but gently." "Your business in the palace?" The man's voice carried the flat professionalism of someone who had asked this question 1,000 times before. Jason met his eyes. "I have come to speak with King Pelias." The guard's gaze dropped to Jason's feet, lingered there for a moment that stretched like honey pouring from a jar, then returned to his face. Something shifted in the man's expression, a tightening around the eyes that might have been recognition or might have been unease. "Many wish to speak with the king," the guard said carefully. "Few are granted the privilege. What name should I carry to him?" Jason felt the moment crystallize around him, felt the words forming on his tongue with the weight of stones dropping into deep water. "Tell him that Jason has come, son of Aeson, son of the rightful king." The silence that followed was not empty. It filled with held breath, with the sudden cessation of nearby conversations, with the soft scrape of leather and bronze as the second guard shifted his stance. The first guard's face went carefully blank, the expression of a man who has just been handed something far too dangerous to carry carelessly. "Wait here," he said, and turned toward the palace entrance, his movements quick and controlled. Jason waited. Around him, the plaza seemed to hold its attention upon him with renewed focus. He did not look at the faces watching from doorways and market stalls. He kept his eyes on the palace gates, on the darkening sky beyond the walls, on the first stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue. The guard returned more quickly than expected, and he was not alone. A man in finer clothing walked beside him, someone whose bearing spoke of authority worn comfortably, like old leather that has molded itself to its wearer's shape. This man studied Jason with eyes that took in everything and revealed nothing. "The king," he said slowly, "will see you." They led him through the gates, across a courtyard where a fountain murmured to itself in the gathering dusk, past more guards who watched with the same carefully neutral expressions. The palace interior was cooler than the evening air outside, the stone walls holding the memory of daytime shade. Torches had been lit in bronze sconces, their flames casting restless shadows across plastered walls decorated with simple geometric patterns, spirals and waves that seemed to move in the flickering light. Jason's bare foot made different sounds than his sandaled one against the stone floor. The rhythm marked his passage like a drum with a broken skin, announcing his presence to anyone with ears to hear. They entered a hall longer and higher than any space Jason had occupied before. Columns supported a ceiling lost in shadow, and at the far end, a chair sat upon a raised platform. Not a throne in the elaborate sense, but a seat that commanded attention through position rather than ornament. And in that seat, waiting with the patience of a spider at the center of its web, sat Pelias. The king was older than Jason had imagined, his beard streaked with gray, his face lined with years of decisions and their consequences. But his eyes remained sharp, and they fixed on Jason with an intensity that felt like being measured for a shroud. Jason walked the length of the hall, his footsteps echoing in the high space. He stopped at what felt like an appropriate distance, neither too close nor too far, and met his uncle's gaze without flinching. "You claim," Pelias said, his voice carrying easily across the intervening space, "to be my nephew, the son of my brother Aeson, who ruled before me." "I do not claim it," Jason replied. "I state it. As I state that this throne was never yours by right, only by force." A ripple of tension moved through the hall. Jason sensed rather than saw the guards shifting, hands moving toward weapons. But Pelias raised one hand slightly, and the movement stopped. "Bold words," the king said, "especially from a young man who arrives alone, wearing one sandal and carrying nothing but a traveler's pack." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, nephew, if indeed you are who you say you are, where have you been all these years? Why appear now, after so long a silence?" "I was kept safe," Jason said. "Raised far from your reach, educated by one who knew the value of patience. I appear now because I am ready, because the time has come to reclaim what was stolen." Pelias smiled, and it was not a kind expression. It was the smile of a man who has played a difficult game for many years and sees a familiar opening. "Reclaim," he repeated, tasting the word. "Such a certain term. Tell me, Jason, son of Aeson, have you come with an army? Do soldiers wait outside my walls? Ready to enforce your claim? I have come alone. Then you are either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish." Pelias settled back in his chair, his fingers drumming once against the armrest. "Perhaps both. The prophecy said you would come, you know. A man with one sandal arriving to challenge my rule. I have been expecting you for quite some time." Jason felt something cold touch his spine. "What prophecy?" "Oh, the oracle was quite clear. A kinsman would come wearing one sandal, and he would be the instrument of my undoing." Pelias's smile widened slightly. "Oracles are troublesome things. They tell you enough to worry about, never enough to prevent. So I have waited, and now here you stand, exactly as foretold." The king rose from his chair, descended the 3 steps to the hall floor, and approached Jason with measured strides. He stopped close enough that Jason could see the silver threads in his beard, the small scar above his left eye, the calculation moving behind his gaze like fish beneath dark water. "I could kill you," Pelias said conversationally. "It would be simple enough. An accident on the road, perhaps. Bandits. Such things happen. Who would question it?" Jason held himself still. "If you intended that, you would not be speaking with me now." "Clever," Pelias acknowledged. "Yes, you have Chiron's teaching in you. I can hear it in your words." He circled Jason slowly, studying him. "Let me propose something different. A test, if you will. A way to prove your worthiness to rule, to demonstrate that you possess not just lineage but capability." "What kind of test?" Pelias completed his circle and faced Jason directly. "In Colchis, far to the east, there hangs a treasure beyond price. The Golden Fleece, guarded by forces both mortal and divine. It belonged once to a sacred ram, and it possesses properties that are said to bring prosperity to the land that holds it." His voice took on a persuasive quality, smooth as oil. "Bring me this fleece. Prove yourself capable of such a quest, and I will yield the throne to you willingly. You will rule not as a usurper or a claimant, but as a proven hero. The people will follow you gladly." Jason studied his uncle's face, searching for the trap he knew must be hidden within the offer. "And if I refuse? Then we are at an impasse. I will not give up my throne simply because a young man appears wearing one sandal and claiming ancient rights. But neither do I wish to spill kinsman's blood if it can be avoided." Pelias spread his hands. "The quest offers us both a path forward. You gain glory and, ultimately, the crown. I maintain order until a worthy successor proves himself." The hall seemed to grow quieter, as if the very stones were listening. Jason stood in the cooling hall, feeling the weight of eyes upon him. Guards, courtiers, the king himself. The torches had burned lower since he entered, their flames steadying into something almost peaceful, casting gentler shadows against the painted walls. Outside, through the high windows, the last blue of evening was fading to black. He considered his uncle's words, turning them over like stones in a stream, searching for hidden edges. The Golden Fleece. He had heard whispers of it during his years with Chiron, fragments of stories carried by travelers who passed through the mountain valleys. A treasure that shimmered like captured sunlight, hanging in a grove at the edge of the known world. Guarded, Pelias had said, by forces both mortal and divine. Which meant, quite simply, that most who sought it never returned. This was the trap, then. Not poison or a blade in the dark, but distance and impossibility. Send the prophesied threat on a quest from which he would never return, and the problem solved itself with clean hands. Yet something in Jason's chest, something he could not quite name, responded to the challenge. Perhaps it was youth, or pride, or the simple fact that he had been raised on stories of heroes who faced impossible tasks and emerged transformed. Perhaps it was knowing that to refuse would be to admit defeat before beginning, to slink back to the mountain with nothing changed. "I accept," Jason said. And the words felt strange in his mouth, both frightening and exhilarating. Pelias's expression shifted, something almost like respect flickering across his features before the mask of calculation returned. "You surprise me, nephew. I expected hesitation, at least. Questions about provisions, ships, crew. Those are practical matters. They can be addressed. But the decision itself?" Jason shook his head slightly. "If I am to rule, I must be willing to do what others cannot." "That begins now." "Well spoken." The king moved back toward his chair but did not sit. "You will need a ship, of course. And crew. Such a voyage cannot be undertaken alone. I will find both," Jason replied. "Unless you intend to hinder me. On the contrary, I will make it known throughout Iolcus that Jason, son of Aeson, seeks the Golden Fleece. Any who wish to join him are free to do so. I will even provide timber and craftsmen for the ship's construction." Pelias smiled again, and this time there was genuine amusement in it. After all, it would hardly be fair to send you on an impossible quest without proper resources. Jason understood the calculation there too. If he failed, no one could say Pelias had not given him every advantage. If he somehow succeeded, a thought his uncle clearly considered unlikely, then the king could claim to have honored his word. They spoke of details then. Practical arrangements that felt oddly mundane after the weight of what had been decided. Jason would be given access to the royal harbor, to skilled shipwrights, to supplies from the palace stores. Word would be sent throughout Greece that a great quest was being undertaken, that heroes were invited to join. As the conversation wound down, Jason found his gaze drifting to the windows again. Full darkness had settled now, and through the opening he could see stars beginning to emerge, faint at first, then growing clearer as his eyes adjusted. The same stars he had studied with Chiron, learning their names and patterns, their slow wheel across the seasons. He thought of his teacher now. Wondered if the old centaur was watching these same stars from his cave, knowing somehow that his student stood in a king's hall accepting an impossible task. Chiron had taught him many things, patience, wisdom, the names of healing herbs and harmful ones, but perhaps the greatest lesson had been this, that some paths must be walked even when the destination remains obscured. "You may stay in the palace tonight," Pelias said, breaking Jason's reverie. "Tomorrow we can begin the practical work. Ships are not built in a day." "Thank you," Jason replied, though he knew the hospitality was more surveillance than kindness. "But I think I will find lodging in the city. I should begin making myself known to those who might join me." Pelias nodded slowly. "As you wish. The gates will remain open to you." Jason turned and walked back down the long hall, his uneven footsteps echoing once more in the high space. Behind him, he felt his uncle's gaze following his departure, felt the weight of calculations being made, possibilities being measured. He passed the guards at the entrance, their faces carefully neutral now, and stepped out into the plaza. The air had cooled considerably. He could smell wood smoke from evening fires, hear the distant sound of the fountain that marked the courtyard, see lights beginning to glow in windows throughout the city. Iolcus spread below him in the darkness, a place of stone and lamplight and sleeping people who did not yet know that tomorrow their world would begin to change. Jason made his way down from the palace district, following streets that grew narrower and more lived in as he descended. He found an inn near the harbor, its common room warm with firelight and conversation. The keeper asked no questions, simply took his coin and gestured toward an empty table near the hearth. He sat there as the evening deepened, listening to the talk around him. Sailors discussing trade routes, merchants complaining about taxes, a woman singing softly in the corner, her voice carrying some old tune that seemed to slip beneath the other sounds like water under stones. Tomorrow, he thought, the real work would begin. But for now, in this moment of quiet between one life and another, he simply sat and let himself feel the weight of what he had undertaken. The Golden Fleece, hanging somewhere beyond the horizon, golden as myth, distant as dreams. And between here and there, an ocean he had never crossed, lands he had never seen, dangers he could not yet imagine. Yet he found he was not afraid, or rather, the fear that existed in him felt clean, uncomplicated, like the fear before a dive into cold water. His uncle expected him to fail, had counted on it, had wagered everything on impossibility maintaining its reputation. But Jason remembered standing beside Chiron, looking up at stars that seemed impossibly distant, and learning that distance was merely time waiting to be crossed. The fire crackled. Someone laughed at a story Jason had not heard. The inn's door opened and closed, bringing momentary draughts of night air. And somewhere in the darkness outside, in cities and islands and wild places he had never visited, heroes slept who did not yet know they were about to be called. Morning would come, as it always did, and with it the beginning of something neither he nor Pelias could fully control. The story was beginning. The Argo was not yet built, but already she existed in the realm of necessity, waiting to take shape beneath skilled hands. Tomorrow he would walk to the harbor and stand where she would rest. Tomorrow word would begin to spread. Tomorrow the first timber would be chosen and blessed. But tonight he simply sat in the warm common room, drinking wine that tasted of resin and honey, listening to the ordinary voices of ordinary people living their ordinary lives. Soon enough, nothing would be ordinary again. Morning arrived with the particular quality of light that only harbor towns know, pale gold reflected off water and stone, carrying the salt taste of distance and possibility. Jason woke to the sound of gulls arguing over something invisible, and fishermen calling to one another in voices roughened by wind and years. He dressed slowly, aware that today marked a threshold. Yesterday he had been simply a young man with a claim. Today he would begin transforming myth into timber and rope and canvas. Today he would call heroes from their scattered lives and ask them to sail towards something that existed mostly in old stories told by firelight. The inn's common room was already half empty when he descended. The keeper's wife offered him bread still warm from the oven and a cup of watered wine. He ate standing, watching through the doorway as the city stirred itself awake around him. The harbor district smelled of fish and tar, and the particular sweetness of fresh-cut wood. Shipwrights were already at work in their yards, the rhythmic sound of adzes and saws creating a music older than any hymn. Jason walked among them slowly, studying the vessels in various stages of completion, fishing boats with their broad bellies, sleek merchant ships built for speed, war galleys with rams like bronze teeth. None of them would suffice. He found what he was looking for at the yard's far end, a space larger than the others, currently empty except for stacked timber and a very old man sitting on a stool, smoking something pungent from a small clay pipe. The man watched Jason approach with eyes that seemed to hold the color of winter sea. "You're the one-sandaled fellow," the old shipwright said. It was not a question. "I am. Pallas says you need a ship, says it needs to be ready before summer's end. Says it needs to be special." The man took another draw from his pipe. "They say lots of things. Palaces do. Most of it whined." Jason smiled. This particular wind carries truth. I need a vessel that can sail beyond the known waters, that can carry 50 men and their provisions, that can survive what no other ship has survived. You're talking about the Symplegades, among other things. The shipwright stood with a crackling of joints that sounded like settling timber. He was shorter than Jason had first thought, bent by decades of work, but his hands, when he gestured, were steady and marked with the scars of his craft. "I'm Argus," he said. "My father taught me shipbuilding. His father taught him." All the way back to when men first thought to trust themselves to hollow wood and hope. He walked to the stacked timber, running one weathered hand along a particular beam. "But this ship you're describing, this wants more than craft. This wants blessing. I know. You'll need timber from Dodona, from the sacred oak grove where Zeus himself speaks through leaves." Jason nodded. Word had already been sent. Pelias, for all his schemes, was providing resources with surprising efficiency. Perhaps he wanted to ensure there could be no excuses when failure came. "The goddess Athena has taken interest," Jason said quietly. "She will guide certain choices." Argus's expression shifted, not quite fear, not quite reverence, but something that contained elements of both. "Well then," he said after a moment, "we'd better begin with prayers." They spent the morning marking out the ship's dimensions in the cleared space. Argus moved with surprising speed once he began, his bent body straightening somewhat as purpose flowed through him. He called measurements that younger men recorded, described curves and angles that existed only in his mind's eye, spoke of keels and ribs and strakes as though they were already present, waiting to be revealed. By noon, a crowd had gathered. Word traveled quickly in harbor towns, especially word involving gods and impossible quests and prophesied princes. Jason found himself answering questions, describing the voyage in terms that felt both inadequate and overly dramatic. Yes, they would sail to Colchis. Yes, they sought the Golden Fleece. Yes, all heroes were welcome to join. A young man stepped forward from the crowd, tall with musician's hands and eyes that seemed to notice everything. "My name is Orpheus," he said. "I play the lyre. I know songs that can calm waves and make rocks weep. If you'll have me, I'll sail with you." Jason felt something shift in his chest. This was the first. The first to answer the call, to step from crowd to crew, to choose the uncertain voyage over the certain shore. "I'll have you gladly," Jason said. "Though I warn you, the songs you'll need to sing may be stranger than any you've learned." Orpheus smiled. "The best songs always are. Others approach throughout the afternoon." Not all were heroes in the traditional sense. A young man named Tiphys, who claimed he could read weather in the flight of birds and navigate by stars most sailors had never named. Twin brothers, Castor and Pollux, who moved with identical grace and finished each other's sentences. An older man named Echion, scarred and quiet, who said simply that he had nothing better to do than die at sea rather than in bed. Each name Jason learned felt like a thread being woven into something larger. By evening, a dozen had pledged themselves. Not 50 yet, not nearly enough, but a beginning. A shape emerging from possibility. As the sun descended toward the water, turning the harbor to hammered copper, a figure appeared at the yard's entrance that made even the chattering crowd fall silent. He was enormous, not merely tall, but broad, in a way that suggested something beyond human proportion. He wore a lion's pelt across his shoulders, the great head hanging down his back, paws knotted at his throat. His arms were corded with muscle that spoke of labors no ordinary man could contemplate. "Heracles," someone whispered. The son of Zeus himself walked forward with surprising likeness for his size. His eyes found Jason's, and something passed between them, recognition perhaps, or simple understanding between men who had both learned that strength alone solved nothing. "I heard there was a voyage being undertaken," Heracles said. His voice was gentler than Jason had expected. "I heard they needed heroes. I thought perhaps they might make do with me instead." Laughter rippled through the crowd, tension breaking like a wave on rocks. "We would be honored," Jason said carefully, "to have you among us." Heracles nodded once, then found a place to sit among the growing company. His presence seemed to shift something fundamental. If the son of Zeus had joined, then perhaps this mad venture was real after all. Perhaps they truly would sail beyond the known world and return. Night settled over the harbor like a familiar cloak. Fires were lit. Wine appeared from sources mysterious and generous. Stories began to flow as freely as the drink. Tales of monsters defeated, gods encountered, narrow escapes from death and stranger fates. Jason found himself sitting slightly apart, watching the gathering crew. Argus had disappeared into his workshop, and the sound of drawing and calculation continued in the darkness. The old shipwright would work through the night, Jason suspected, translating vision into something that could be built by hands and measured by lines. Tomorrow, more would come. Word was spreading across Greece like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Soon there would be Atalanta, swift as wind and deadly with her bow. Meleager, Peleus, Telamon, Laertes, names that would echo through time, gathered now in service to a quest that seemed to shimmer between reality and dream. The Argo was taking shape, not yet in wood and bronze, but in the minds of those who would sail her. Jason looked up at the stars emerging in the deepening blue. Chiron would be proud, he thought. Not of the ambition or the danger, but of the simple fact that he had learned to gather people rather than face impossibility alone. The fire crackled. Someone started singing, and Orpheus joined in, his voice weaving harmonies that made the simple tune sound ancient and new at once. The work would begin in earnest tomorrow, the actual building, the gathering of provisions, the thousand details that transformed intention into departure. But tonight, in this moment, suspended between decision and action, Jason simply let himself be present among these brave, foolish, necessary souls who had chosen to follow a one-sandaled stranger toward the edge of the world. The Argo was coming. He could feel her already, waiting in that space where dreams solidify into destiny. The first timber was chosen at dawn, when light filtered through the harbor mist like honey through cloth. Argus moved through the stacked logs with the deliberation of a priest selecting sacrifice, running his weathered hands across bark still damp with mourning, listening to what the wood had to say. He paused at a massive pine trunk, its surface marked with the dark resin that wept from old wounds, and nodded once. "This one," he said, "for the keel. Everything else will rest upon her back." The gathered Argonauts stepped forward without needing instruction. Even Heracles, who could have lifted the timber alone, took his place among the others. Hands found purchase on rough bark. Muscles tensed. Together they carried it to the building frame Argus had marked out in the swept dirt, laying it down with a gentleness that belied its weight. The wood settled with a sound like a long breath released. Argus knelt beside it, producing from his belt a piece of charcoal. He began to mark measurements, lips moving in silent calculation. The numbers were his own language, known only to those who understood how forces moved through joined wood and how water pushed against a hull. Jason watched from the shade of a fig tree, cup of watered wine cooling in his hands. He had learned something from Chiron that most never quite grasped. The hardest part of leadership was knowing when not to lead, when to step back and let mastery express itself without interference. Argus needed no instruction. The heroes needed no command. They had become, overnight, something resembling a crew. More arrived as the morning aged. A woman appeared at midday, bow slung across her back, stride so efficient it seemed she moved through a different world than ordinary walkers. Her name was Atalanta, and she spoke only to say she could shoot the eye from a flying hawk and track prey across stone. Several of the men exchanged glances, uncertain what to make of a woman among their ranks. She ignored them with the ease of someone who had been ignoring men her entire life. "Can you sail?" Jason asked. "Can you?" she replied, eyes the color of forest shadows meeting his without flinching. He smiled. "Not yet." But I'm learning. She nodded once and found a place in the shade, drawing her knees up and watching the work with the patience of a hunter waiting for deer to appear. The shipbuilding itself became a kind of meditation. Sawdust caught the light, falling like snow that never touched the ground. The rasp of planes smoothing planks created rhythms that matched the breathing of whoever pulled them. When Orpheus played his lyre during the work, the tools themselves seemed to move more smoothly, as if even bronze and iron responded to beauty. Argus worked with an intensity that suggested he was building not just a ship, but an answer to some question he had carried all his life. He showed them how to scarf joints together, overlapping planks in patterns that would flex with the sea rather than fight it, how to drill holes for the bronze pins that would hold everything together, how to seal seams with pitch mixed with beeswax until they wept no water. "A ship is alive," he told them one afternoon, pausing to wipe sweat from his weathered brow. She breathes. She complains when treated poorly and sings when treated well. Build her with respect, and she'll carry you through storms that would shatter stone. The heroes listened with the seriousness of students before a master. Even Heracles, who had wrestled gods and monsters, learned to measure twice and cut once, to test the grain of wood before committing blade to surface. Days folded into one another like waves meeting shore. The skeleton of the Argo began to rise, ribs curving up from the keel like the chest of some great beast learning to breathe. Jason found himself falling asleep each night to the memory of hammer on bronze, the smell of fresh-cut pine, the sound of men working in harmony towards something none of them could yet quite picture as complete. More heroes arrived with each passing day. Meleager, who had killed the Caledonian boar and wore its tusks on a leather cord. Peleus, father of a son who would one day eclipse them all in fame. Laertes, who spoke little but whose eyes missed nothing. Each brought their own gifts, their own reasons for choosing the uncertain sea over the certain land. Provisions began to accumulate in the warehouse Argus had commandeered. Clay jars of oil and wine marked with symbols only Tiphys could read, sacks of grain that would keep them fed when land grew scarce. Fishing nets woven by women who worked in silence, their fingers moving through patterns older than language, bronze hooks, iron nails, spare rope coiled like sleeping serpents. Jason made himself learn all of it. Where the water was stored, how much food a crew of 50 needed for a month at sea, which herbs could cure spoiled stomachs and which would draw infection from wounds. Chiron had taught him that true knowledge lived in details others considered beneath notice. One evening, as purple light spread across the harbor like spilled wine, Orpheus approached Jason where he sat reviewing inventories by lamplight. "You're not what I expected," the musician said without preamble. Jason looked up, curious. "What did you expect?" Someone louder. Someone who needed us to believe he was a hero. Orpheus settled onto a coil of rope, his lyre resting across his knees. "But you're building something else, aren't you? Not a legend." "A crew." Jason considered this. "Legends," he said slowly, "happen to people whether they want them or not. Crews, you have to build one person at a time." Orpheus smiled and drew a soft melody from his strings, something wordless that sounded like contentment. The Argo grew. Her prow rose like a question mark against the sky. Her stern curved back in an answer that had not yet been spoken. Athena herself, it was whispered, had guided Argus in dreams, showing him shapes that mortal minds rarely glimpsed. Whether this was true or simply the kind of story that gathered around significant endeavors, none could say for certain. What was certain was this: the ship taking form in Iolcus harbor was unlike any that had come before. Her lines suggested speed and strength in equal measure. Her joints fit so precisely that even unpitched they seemed reluctant to admit water. And in her prow, Argus installed a piece of wood that made even skeptical sailors pause and whisper. "It was oak," he said, "from the sacred grove of Dodona, where Zeus's oracle spoke through rustling leaves." The goddess herself had decreed that this timber be included, that the Argo might carry prophecy in her very bones and speak when speech was needed most. Jason stood before it one morning, hand resting on the dark wood. It was warm beneath his palm, warm in a way that sunlight alone could not explain. "Will you speak to me?" he asked quietly, half joking, half hoping. The wood said nothing. But something in the quality of silence suggested patience rather than absence, as if the timber was simply waiting for the right questions to be asked. The heroes continued their work. Muscles remembering rhythms, hands growing calloused in new patterns. They were becoming something more than a collection of famous names. They were becoming the crew of the Argo, defined not by past glory but by shared purpose and the slow, patient work of transformation. As another evening settled over the harbor, Jason climbed to a hill overlooking the yard where torches now burned against the gathering dark. Below, the Argo stood half-finished, ribs reaching toward stars that wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. In a few weeks, perhaps a month, she would be complete. They would load her with provisions and hope, push her into water that would either hold her or swallow her, and point her prow toward the horizon where the known world ended and legend began. But that was tomorrow's concern. Tonight, the work continued in the kind of peace that comes only from doing difficult things well and doing them together. Somewhere in the darkness, Orpheus was singing. Somewhere else, Argus was still planning, still calculating, still translating divine vision into mortal craft. Jason breathed the salt air and let himself feel, just for a moment, the simple joy of watching something impossible become real. The morning Hylas arrived. The harbor mist had not yet lifted. He came walking down the coast road with nothing but a waterskin and a knife at his belt, young enough that his beard was still soft as down. Heracles saw him first and raised one enormous hand in greeting, and something in the gesture spoke of old affection, of bonds that needed no explanation. Jason watched them embrace. The giant and the youth, and understood without being told that Hylas was not here to prove anything. He was here because Heracles was here, and that was reason enough. "Can you row?" Jason asked when Heracles brought him forward for introduction. "Well enough," Hylas said, his voice quiet but steady. "And I know how to find fresh water, how to set snares, how to keep a fire going in rain. Practical skills. The kind that kept crews alive when glory had faded into hunger and wet rope." Jason nodded approval and watched Heracles' face ease into something almost like contentment. The work entered its final phase. The hull was complete now, sealed with pitch that gleamed black as obsidian in the morning light. Tiphys supervised the installation of the mast, a single column of pine that rose 30 feet toward the sky, straight as truth. The sail was being woven in a warehouse nearby, women working thread into patterns that would catch the wind and hold it. Benches for the oarsmen were fitted into place. Smooth wood that would grow familiar to tired muscles over countless hours of rowing. 50 benches in all, 25 to each side, positioned so that the rowers could work in synchronized rhythm without fouling one another's strokes. Jason tried sitting on each one, feeling how they fit different bodies, noting which positions would suit shorter men and which required longer reach. Atalanta found him at this task one afternoon and raised an eyebrow. "Planning to row every position yourself?" she asked. "Learning where to put people," he replied. "Strength matters, but rhythm matters more. If the timing is wrong, it doesn't matter how strong the rowers are." She settled onto a bench and tested the oar, her hunter's hands finding the balance point naturally. "You think like a craftsman, not a hero. Maybe that's because heroes are easier to remember than they are to be." She laughed, a sound like water over stones, and pulled a few experimental strokes. The oar moved smoothly in its leather housing, the motion easy despite the weight. Good engineering. Argus had thought of everything. The Argo's figurehead was installed on a morning when the sea lay flat as hammered bronze. It depicted a woman with wind-swept hair and eyes that seemed to follow whoever looked at her. Not Athena, though some claimed to see her features there. Not any goddess, perhaps, but rather the spirit of the ship herself, carved in wood that remembered being forest. Orpheus sang when they lifted it into place, a hymn so old that no one knew who had first sung it. The words spoke of journeys and homecomings, of safe harbor and strong winds, of courage that outlasted fear. The figurehead fit perfectly, and when it was secured, the Argo seemed suddenly complete. She was no longer timber and pitch and human ambition. She was herself, ready for water, waiting for purpose. Heracles organized the loading with military precision. Water casks were placed low in the hull for ballast. Grain sacks were stacked where they would stay dry but remain accessible. Amphoras of wine and oil were secured against rolling. Spare rope, extra sailcloth, fishing gear, weapons wrapped in oiled leather, everything had its place. Carefully considered, properly stored. Hylas worked beside him, learning the ship's geography, memorizing where things lived so he could find them blindfolded in storm or darkness. He had clever hands and a methodical mind, and Jason noticed that Heracles was teaching him the way Chiron had once taught Jason, with patience and attention, and the kind of care that cost nothing except time. The night before launching, the Argonauts gathered on the beach for a feast. Local women had prepared food enough for an army. There was roasted lamb and fresh bread, honey cakes and cheese aged in mountain caves, wine that tasted of sun-warmed grapes and distant summers. Torches burned in a wide circle, their light pushing back the darkness, creating a space where heroes could eat and laugh and tell stories without the weight of destiny pressing quite so heavily on their shoulders. Jason found himself sitting between Orpheus and Tiphys, watching the others. Castor and Pollux were wrestling for entertainment, their matched strength creating a contest that might last until dawn. Atalanta was demonstrating how to fletch arrows to a group of younger heroes who listened with expressions of focused concentration. Heracles sat slightly apart with Hylas beside him, the two of them talking quietly, their conversation private despite the crowd. "They'll follow you," Tiphys said, noticing Jason's gaze. "Not because you're loudest or strongest, but because you make them feel like the voyage matters more than the glory." Jason turned his wine cup in his hands, watching firelight play across its surface. "The voyage does matter more. Glory is just the story people tell afterward, if they remember to tell it at all." Orpheus plucked a soft note on his lyre. "Some of us will die," he said matter-of-factly. Quests of this magnitude always demand that price. The words should have been grim, but somehow they weren't. They were simply true, spoken without drama or fear, acknowledged the way sailors acknowledge weather. "Then we make sure," Jason said quietly, "that whoever dies, dies among friends, and whoever lives remembers them properly." They drank to that, and the night continued its gentle arc toward dawn. At sunrise, half the city came to watch the launching. The Argo sat on rollers now, poised at the edge of the water, ready for her first touch of sea. Priests had blessed her with oil and wine. Prayers had been offered to Poseidon, to Athena, to all the gods who watched over travelers and fools. Jason stood at the prow with his hand on the sacred timber from Dodona. The wood thrummed beneath his palm, almost imperceptibly, as if the ship itself was breathing. "Ready?" Argus asked beside him. Jason looked back at his crew. 50 heroes gripped the ropes that would pull the Argo forward. They waited without impatience, muscles ready, faces calm. Whatever came next, they would face it together. "Ready," Jason said. Argus gave the signal. The Argonauts pulled. The ship groaned, resisted, then began to move. Slowly at first, then gathering momentum, the Argo rolled toward the water that would become her home. Rollers creaked. Ropes sang with tension. The crowd cheered, but the sound seemed distant, belonging to some other moment. The Argo reached the waterline. Her prow touched the sea, and then she was floating, rocking gently in the morning swell, held by the element she was built to master. She rode high and proud, her lines clean, her balance perfect. The sacred timber did not speak, not in words. But Jason felt something shift in the quality of silence, as if the ship had just opened her eyes for the first time and found herself exactly where she was meant to be. The Argonauts boarded in pairs, testing the ship's balance as she settled into her new element. Each hero found his rowing bench, running hands along smooth wood still fragrant with sawdust and resin. The oars were fitted through their ports, long blades of seasoned ash that caught morning light like wings waiting to unfold. Jason took his place at the steering oar. Tiffys stood beside him, one hand resting on the tiller with the casual confidence of a man who had held 100 such positions. The helmsman's eyes were already reading the water, noting how currents moved around the harbor mouth, where wind stirred the surface into patterns that told stories sailors learned to hear. "Let them find their rhythm first," Tiffys murmured. "Don't push for speed today. Just let the Argo teach them how she wants to move." Orpheus sat near the mast with his lyre waiting. When Jason nodded, the poet began to play. Not a rowing song, not yet. Just a gentle melody that established tempo, something the oars could follow without strain. The music floated across water that barely rippled, and 50 blades dipped as one. The Argo glided forward. She moved with unexpected grace, responding to the oars as if she had been born swimming. The harbor slipped past on either side, stone walls giving way to open coast. Behind them, Iolcus grew smaller, becoming memory, becoming the place they would someday return to, changed. By midday they had found their rhythm properly. The oars rose and fell in perfect sequence, each stroke drawing them further into blue distance. Orpheus had shifted to a steadier tune, something with more backbone, and the Argonauts rowed without speaking. Their breathing synchronized, muscles warming into the work. Jason felt the steering oar come alive in his hands. The Argo responded to the slightest pressure, eager and intelligent, reading his intentions almost before he formed them. The sacred timber hummed against his palm occasionally, offering what might have been approval or simply noting its own contentment with wind and wave. 3 days they rowed along familiar coasts, building strength and unity, learning how the ship liked to be handled. They stopped each evening at beaches where streams ran down to meet the sea, pulling the Argo onto sand and setting watches while the rest gathered driftwood for fires. On the 4th morning, Tiffys pointed northeast toward open water. "Lemnos lies that way. 2 days if the wind favors us. After that, we leave known waters behind." The island appeared late on the 6th day, rising from evening mist like something half-remembered. Lemnos sat low and green, wrapped in grape arbors and olive groves, its single harbor protected by stone arms that reached into the sea. Smoke rose from cooking fires, thin and peaceful in the settling dusk. But something felt wrong. Jason couldn't name it at first, just an absence in the air, a silence where certain sounds should live. No fishing boats returning with the day's catch. No men's voices calling from the docks. Only women watching from the shore, their expressions impossible to read across the distance. The Argonauts shipped their oars and let the Argo drift into the harbor. Women lined the waterfront now, dozens of them, wearing clothes that ranged from simple tunics to elaborate robes. They stood perfectly still, neither welcoming nor threatening, just watching with the patience of those who had been waiting a very long time. A tall woman stepped forward. She wore purple bordered with gold thread, her dark hair braided with flowers that released their scent across the water. Her face carried authority without harshness, beauty without softness. "I am Hypsipyle," she called, her voice clear and measured. "Queen of Lemnos. We have been expecting travelers, though we did not know when they would come." Jason stood at the prow. "I am Jason of Iolcus. These are the Argonauts. We seek supplies and a night's rest before continuing to Colchis." "We mean no harm to you or yours." Hypsipyle smiled, and the expression transformed her face into something warmer, more human. "No harm shall find you here. Come ashore, share our food and wine." It has been too long since we heard news of the wider world. They beached the Argo on sand that felt unusually soft beneath their feet, almost welcoming. The women approached then, slowly, offering wine mixed with honey, bread still warm from ovens, platters of figs and cheese. Their hospitality was genuine but carried an undercurrent Jason couldn't quite identify. Like music played in a minor key, Hypsipyle led them through streets lined with flowering vines to a courtyard where tables had been laid beneath a grape arbor heavy with fruit. Oil lamps hung from branches, their flames steady in the windless evening. The Argonauts settled onto cushioned benches while women brought course after course, roasted fish with herbs, vegetables glazed in golden oil, pastries dripping honey. Wine that tasted of summer afternoons and forgotten contentment. Atalanta sat beside Jason, her eyes moving constantly, cataloguing details. "No men," she whispered, "not one. Not even boys old enough to walk." Jason had noticed. Every face around them was female, young and old, but none male. The absence created a peculiar atmosphere, as if the island existed slightly outside normal time, preserved in some eternal female present. "Where are your men?" Jason asked Hypsipyle when the meal had settled into comfortable conversation. He kept his tone gentle, genuinely curious rather than demanding. The Queen's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. "Gone," she said simply. "They abandoned us for Thracian women they claimed were more pleasing, so we made Lemnos our own." "We need no one." The bitterness in her voice was old, worn smooth by time, but still present beneath the surface. Around the courtyard, other women had grown very still, remembering things they chose not to speak. "Yet you welcome us," Jason observed. "We are not bitter toward all men," Hypsipyle replied. "Only those who proved unworthy of trust. And you," she gestured at the gathered heroes. "You are different. Travelers with purpose. Heroes seeking something greater than comfort. Perhaps from such men we can accept company without surrendering what we have built." The evening deepened. Orpheus played songs that made the stars seem brighter overhead. Wine flowed freely, and gradually the Argonauts relaxed into the strange peace of the island. Women sat among them now, talking quietly, sharing stories of places they had traveled before, choosing to remain here. Their voices carried a quality of contentment, as if they had found something worth keeping. Days passed like honey dripping. The Argonauts meant to stay only a night, but Lemnos had a way of making time feel negotiable. The women offered them soft beds in houses that smelled of lavender and sun-dried linen. They showed them gardens where fruit hung heavy and ripe, vineyards where grapes split their skins with sweetness, springs where water ran clear and cold from living rock. Jason found himself sitting with Hypsipyle in her garden one afternoon while bees worked the flowering thyme and fountains murmured conversations with themselves. She asked about his quest, and he told her about the fleece, about Peleus and prophecy and the throne that waited in Iolcus. "And after?" she asked. "When you have the fleece, when you have reclaimed your kingdom, what then?" Jason had no answer. He had never imagined beyond the moment of return, the fleece in his hands, his purpose fulfilled. The question opened spaces in his mind he wasn't ready to explore. That night, lying in a bed too soft and a room too quiet, Jason felt the fleece calling like a dream, half remembered. It pulled at something deep in his chest. A golden thread wound around his heart, gentle but insistent. In the morning, he found Heracles standing at the waterfront, looking at the Argo where she rested on the beach. The ship's timbers had already begun to silver slightly in the salt air, taking on the patina of something permanent rather than transient. "We're forgetting," Heracles said without preamble. "The quest. The fleece. The reason we're here at all. Lemnos is kind, but kindness can be its own trap." Jason knew he was right. The island had wrapped itself around them like warm water, and staying would be easy, too easy. They could grow old here among gardens and gentle voices, their names becoming stories the women told to children who would never quite understand why they mattered. "Tomorrow," Jason said. "We leave at dawn." The Argonauts received the news with mixed expressions. Some nodded immediately, hands already reaching for weapons that had lain untouched for days. Others looked away toward the inland hills where smoke rose from evening fires, and women sang songs in voices that had learned to fill all the silences men had left behind. Hypsipyle came to the harbor that final evening carrying a clay cup painted with running deer. She offered it to Jason without ceremony. "Safe passage," she said, "and may your golden fleece prove worth the leaving." Her words carried no bitterness. She had known from the beginning that heroes do not settle, cannot remain still when purpose calls. The island had given what it could give, a pause between trials, a breath before the next test. Some gifts are meant to be temporary. That night, Jason walked alone through streets he had come to know, past fountains whose particular music he could now identify, through gardens where specific olive trees had become familiar landmarks. Lemnos had offered him something rare, a glimpse of what life might be without quests and prophecies, and the weight of stolen thrones pressing against his shoulders. But the fleece called louder in the darkness. It pulled at him like tide pulls water, inevitable and patient. He returned to the Argo and slept on her deck beneath stars that seemed already to be moving eastward, leading toward Colchis and the trials that waited there. Dawn came with the particular clarity that follows difficult decisions. The women of Lemnos gathered on the shore, not weeping, not speaking, simply bearing witness as the Argonauts pushed the great ship back into water that accepted her weight with barely a ripple. Orpheus struck one pure note on his lyre, a tone that hung in the air like farewell-given voice. The oars found their rhythm again. After days of stillness, the motion felt both strange and right, muscles remembering work they were made for. The Argo moved slowly at first, reluctant perhaps, or maybe that was just Jason's imagination investing the ship with feelings she did not possess. But gradually the current caught them. The wind filled the sail that had hung slack and decorative in Lemnos's protected harbor, and the island began to diminish behind them. Hypsipyle stood on the shore until distance made her indistinguishable from the other women. Then, until the women themselves were just a dark line against pale sand. Then, until even the island was merely a green suggestion dissolving into morning haze. Jason did not watch her fade. He kept his eyes forward, toward the northeast where Phineas's prophecy drew them like a lodestone draws iron. The sea changed as they left Lemnos's influence. The water grew darker, more active, restless in ways the calm harbor had never been. Waves developed personalities, some helpful, pushing the Argo forward, others resistant, slapping at her hull as if testing her determination. The sky stretched wider here, clouds moving in formations that seemed almost intentional, almost conscious. 3 days they rode through waters that grew progressively stranger. The color shifted from familiar blue to something closer to slate, then to a peculiar gray-green that Tiphys said meant they approached the boundaries between known and unknown seas. Fish that surfaced near the ship were species none of them recognized, silver things with too many fins, creatures that watched with eyes that held more intelligence than fish should possess. On the 4th morning, Atalanta called out from her position near the prow. Land. North and east. Mountains. They came into view slowly, peaks that rose from the sea like the world's broken teeth, jagged and dark against a sky gone suddenly pale. Between 2 of these mountains, barely visible at this distance, was a gap, a strait. The passage Phineas had warned them of, where the Symplegades waited. The clashing rocks. 2 floating islands that smashed together periodically, crushing anything caught between them into splinters and foam. No ship had ever passed through. Sailors who approached close enough to see the rocks in action inevitably turned back, choosing longer routes around rather than death in the strait. But there was no longer route for the Argonauts. The fleece lay beyond this passage, in Colchis where King Aeetes guarded treasures he had no intention of surrendering. The Symplegades were not optional. They were the gate, and the gate had to be opened. As they approached, the rocks themselves came into focus. They were not merely large, they were enormous, each one a floating mountain crowned with scrub vegetation and circled by seabirds that had learned the rhythm of their movement. The strait between them looked deceptively calm, a corridor of smooth water perhaps 50 ship lengths wide. But Jason could see the edges of both rocks were stained with something dark, barnacles grown over wood fragments. The accumulated evidence of vessels that had attempted this passage before. The rocks were still now, resting in their separated position, but even in stillness they radiated menace, two colossal fists waiting to close on anything foolish enough to enter their domain. Tiffys brought the Argo to a halt just outside the strait, oars backing water to hold position. The crew fell silent, each hero contemplating the passage ahead and calculating their chances. The mathematics were not encouraging. Phineas said to send a dove first, Jason said quietly, to test the timing. Atalanta produced a white bird from the covered basket she had carried from Thrace, part of Phineas's specific instructions. The dove sat calmly in her hands, preening its feathers, utterly unaware of the role it was about to play in determining whether 50 heroes lived or died. Jason took the bird gently. It was warm and light, its heartbeat rapid against his palm. He thought of Lemnos, of soft beds and fountain music, and Hypsipyle's garden, where the greatest danger was ripening fruit, attracting too many wasps. That peace seemed impossibly distant now, separated from this moment by more than days of sailing. When the rocks part, Jason said to the gathered crew, when the dove flies through, we row. We row harder than we have ever rowed. We row as if rowing itself could hold back death. Because it can, it must. The Argonauts gripped their oars. Orpheus positioned his lyre, ready to strike the tempo that would drive their desperate sprint through the strait. Tiffys stood at the steering oar with hands steady and eyes calculating angles and currents with helmsman's instinct. The rocks remained still, waiting. Birds circled overhead, crying in voices that sounded almost like warnings. The water in the strait was so smooth it looked solid, a road of glass leading to Colchis or oblivion. Jason raised the dove. Athena, he whispered, guide her wings. Poseidon, still your waters. Zeus, if you ever meant for this quest to succeed, help us now. The dove lifted from his hands with a flutter of white wings. It rose into clear air, circling once as if orienting itself, then turned toward the strait. The Symplegades, as if sensing prey, began to groan. Deep within their mass, something ancient and mechanical stirred. The rocks began to move. The dove flew straight and true, white against the pale sky like a prayer-given form. The rocks accelerated, tons of stone rushing toward collision with a sound like continents grinding together. Water between them began to churn as air was compressed, forced outward in waves that reached the Argo even at her safe distance. The bird reached the midpoint just as the rocks met. The collision was thunder made solid, a boom that echoed across the sea and sent clouds of seabirds scattering in panic. Spray erupted where the rock faces came together, and for a moment nothing existed in that strait except impact and foam. Then silence. The rocks parted slowly, reluctantly, retreating to their separated positions like fists unclenching after a blow. The water calmed again, glass smooth, innocent. On the Argo's deck, Atalanta released a breath. Look. The dove appeared from behind the eastern rock, flying with strong, steady wing beats toward open water. Only her tail feathers were missing, plucked away by the rock's closing edges. But she lived. The passage was possible. Now, Jason said. Orpheus struck his lyre, a driving rhythm that matched heartbeats and purpose. The Argonauts bent to their oars as one, blades cutting water in perfect unison. The Argo leaped forward like a living thing released from constraint, her prow aimed at the narrow corridor between those waiting stone giants. The rocks began their groan again almost immediately. Sensing new prey. The sound vibrated through water and wood, through oar handles and bones, a low note that spoke of weight and inevitability and the simple physics of massive objects in motion. faster. The Argo surged ahead, oars flashing in rhythm with Orpheus's music. Tiphys held the steering oar with white-knuckled hands, making tiny corrections to keep them centered in the channel. Jason stood at the prow watching the rocks accelerate toward each other, calculating speed and distance with desperate precision. They entered the strait. Walls of stone rose on either side, so close Jason could see individual stones embedded in their surfaces, fragments of ships that had failed this test. Barnacles thick as forests. Seaweed trailing like hair from impossible heights. The rocks were moving faster now, closing with momentum that seemed to defy natural law. The Argonauts rowed without speaking, without thinking, every muscle burning with effort that transcended pain and entered some realm beyond physical limits. Orpheus's music drove them forward, melody woven with something primal and necessary, the song that life sings against death. Halfway through. The rocks were 40 ship lengths apart, then 30. Their shadows fell across the Argo's deck like judgments. Wind generated by their movement began to howl through the strait, pushing against the ship's sail, threatening to slow their desperate sprint. 20 lengths apart. The sound was deafening now. Rock grinding against water, grinding against air. The whole world compressed into this passage and this moment. Jason could see the other side, open water bright with freedom, impossibly distant despite being barely 100 oar strokes ahead. 10 lengths. The rocks' faces were so close he could have thrown a stone and struck them. Birds nested in crevices stared down with black eyes that had witnessed countless failures. The water itself seemed compressed, thicker, resistant to the Argo's passage, as if the sea had chosen sides. 5 lengths. Tiphys shouted something lost in the roar. The steering oar bent under impossible pressure as he fought to keep them centered. An oar on the port side cracked but held, the hero rowing it, gritting teeth against splinters driven into palms. The rocks met behind them with thunder that shook the sky itself. The Argo shot forward through the gap, propelled partially by her own speed and partially by the blast of compressed air expelled by the collision. Her stern ornament, carved wood blessed by priests in Iolcus harbor, sheared away as the rock's edges scraped past. Then they were through. Open water ahead, the rocks behind them groaning as they parted once more. But the Argo was beyond their reach now, beyond their ancient hunger. The dove that Atalanta had released sat on the mast crossbar, preening feathers that were whole except for those lost tail plumes. The Argonauts collapsed over their oars, chests heaving. Hands bleeding, muscles trembling from effort that had exceeded anything training could prepare for. Orpheus set down his lyre with fingers gone numb from striking strings. Tiphys released the steering oar and sat heavily on the deck, face gray with exhaustion. Behind them, the Symplegades moved one final time. They came together slowly, deliberately, then settled against each other with a sound like finality. According to the prophecy Phineus had shared, once a ship passed through successfully, the rocks would join forever and never move again. The gate had been opened by the Argo's passage, and in opening had closed permanently. Jason looked back at the joined mountains, at the strait that was no longer a passage but a wall. The old world lay behind that barrier now. Everything familiar, everything known. Ahead stretched waters no Greek ship had crossed in living memory, leading to Colchis where the fleece hung in a sacred grove, and King Aeetes waited with hospitality that would prove colder than his northern seas. The afternoon sun emerged from behind clouds, warming decks still wet with spray. The water here was calmer, darker, with a quality that spoke of depth and ancient currents. Islands appeared on the southern horizon, green and mysterious, their beaches unmarked by human habitation. Tiphys recovered enough to stand and take the steering oar again. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the worn wood, but his eyes were clear when he looked at Jason. The hardest gate is past. Whatever waits in Colchis, at least we know we can reach it. Atalanta moved among the crew, checking injuries, binding hands torn by desperate rowing. Most were minor, fingers rubbed raw, palms blistered. One hero had pulled something in his shoulder during that final sprint, but he waved away concern with a grimace that might have been a smile. As evening approached, they found a sheltered bay on one of those unnamed islands and drew the Argo onto a sandy beach. Fires were built, food prepared from stores growing lower but still adequate. Wine was passed around, stronger than usual. And no one complained about the extra ration. Orpheus played gentle melodies while they ate, nothing like the driving rhythm that had pulled them through the Symplegades. This was music for healing, for letting muscles unknot and hearts slow to normal pace. The sound drifted across still water toward forests that whispered with winds carrying unfamiliar scents. Jason sat slightly apart, watching stars emerge in a sky that showed different constellations than the ones visible from Greek shores. The fleece pulled at him still, that sense of inevitable arrival growing stronger now that the greatest barrier had fallen behind them. Tomorrow they would enter the river Phasis that led to Colchis. Tomorrow the quest would transform from journey into confrontation. But tonight, rest. Tonight, gratitude for survival, and for the dove's white wings, and for hands strong enough to bend oars past breaking. Tonight, the peace of having passed through Death's Gate and emerged intact on the other side, where unknown waters reflected stars that watched without judgment, and the future waited with patience born of certainty. The river Phasis revealed itself at dawn, a wide mouth opening between hills covered in cypress trees that grew so densely their shadows pooled like spilled ink. The water here was the color of old bronze, different from the blue Aegean the Argonauts had known all their lives. It tasted different, too, carrying minerals and memories from mountain sources that rose in lands where Greek was never spoken. The Argo turned inland, oars dipping into currents that ran counter to expectation, swirling in patterns that suggested depth beyond measuring. Birds with unfamiliar plumage watched from overhanging branches, calling in voices that sounded almost like warnings. The air grew heavier, thick with moisture, and the scent of flowers that bloomed nowhere in Greece. Tiphys navigated by instinct now, following the main channel where it split around islands choked with vegetation. Reed beds rustled, though no wind touched them. Occasionally they glimpsed structures on the distant banks, buildings of mud brick and timber that housed people who stopped their work to stare at the foreign ship passing upstream. Jason stood at the prow, one hand resting on the rail where the sacred timber from Dodona occasionally murmured fragments of prophecy too soft to understand clearly. The fleece's pull had become almost physical, a thread tied somewhere behind his breastbone, drawing him forward with gentle but absolute insistence. Medea woke that morning in her chamber high in her father's palace, knowing something had shifted in the world's balance, though she could not name what. She was daughter to King Aeetes, priestess of Hecate, trained in herbs and incantations since childhood. Her hands knew how to brew potions that could heal or harm, her voice could speak words that made shadows listen. She had dreamed of ships, though ships rarely troubled her sleeping mind. In the dream, a vessel with eyes painted on its prow had sailed through gates of stone that should have crushed it. A man stood at the front, his face unclear but his presence somehow familiar, as if she had been waiting for him without knowing she waited. The morning felt strange against her skin as she dressed in robes dyed the color of midnight. Her serving women braided her dark hair with careful fingers, weaving in threads of silver that caught light like trapped starshine. She ate breakfast without tasting it, her attention drawn repeatedly to the eastern windows that overlooked the river. The Argo appeared around the final bend just before midday, her painted eyes seeming to search the palace walls as she approached the city docks. The Golden Fleece hanging in its grove 3 miles distant seemed to pulse once, recognizing that those who sought it had finally arrived. Colchis spread along both banks of the Phasis, a city of strange beauty where bronze statues stood in gardens filled with flowers that bloomed in impossible colors. The palace dominated the northern bank, its walls faced with sheets of hammered metal that blazed in sunlight. Towers rose at each corner, topped with symbols sacred to gods the Argonauts did not recognize. Citizens gathered along the waterfront as the Argo drew near, their faces curious but not welcoming. These were people who had lived long ages without visitors from across the sea. Strangers meant disruption, change, the possibility of violence. Children were pulled back from the water's edge by cautious mothers. The Argonauts shipped oars and let momentum carry them to an empty section of dock. Jason stepped onto foreign wood with the same careful dignity he had maintained throughout the journey, aware that every gesture would be observed and interpreted. His companions followed, arranging themselves in a formation that suggested strength without threatening aggression. King Aeetes appeared with a retinue of guards and advisors. Descending from the palace on steps carved from dark stone, he was tall, broad across the shoulders, with a beard shot through with grey and eyes that assessed the strangers with cold intelligence. His robes were embroidered with symbols of the sun, his father Helios, who drove the chariot of daylight across the sky. The king's voice carried across the dock without needing to rise. Greeks, you have sailed far from your familiar waters. State your purpose in Colchis. Jason bowed with the exact depth appropriate for addressing a foreign king. I am Jason of Iolcus, son of Aeson, rightful heir to a throne held by a usurper. I come seeking the golden fleece that hangs in your sacred grove, offered as a test of worthiness by the man who stole my father's crown. Grant me this treasure, and I will owe you a debt that Greece will honor. Aeetes' expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been amusement or might have been contempt. The fleece, of course. The fleece that hangs beneath the oak where no man walks, guarded by the serpent that never sleeps. You understand what you ask? I understand it is accounted impossible, Jason replied steadily. I ask nonetheless. For a long moment, the king simply looked at him, measuring worth the way a smith might test metal for flaws. Then he smiled, and the smile held no warmth. Very well, I am not unreasonable. Perform the tasks I set, and the fleece is yours. Fail, and you and your men will never see Greece again. He outlined the trials with a voice like iron scraping stone. Yoke the bronze-hooved bulls that breathed fire, plough the stony field of Ares, sow dragons' teeth in the furrows, defeat the warriors that would spring full-armed from the earth. Accomplish all this in a single day, and the fleece could be claimed. The Argonauts stood silent, understanding the impossibility being described. These were not tasks meant to be completed. They were elaborate methods of execution dressed in the language of trial and honor. Jason met the king's eyes without flinching. I accept your conditions. When may I attempt these tasks? Tomorrow at sunrise, Aeetes said. Tonight you will be given quarters in the palace as befits foreign guests. Food and wine will be provided. Consider it your final meal, though I phrase it as hospitality. He turned and climbed back toward his palace, guards falling into formation around him. The crowd along the waterfront began to disperse, already whispering about the foolish Greeks who had sailed so far only to die in rituals they could not possibly survive. From her window high above, Medea watched the strangers being led through palace gates. She saw the man who had stood at the ship's prow, and her heart stopped, then resumed beating in a rhythm that felt new and dangerous. The dream had not prepared her for this, for the way recognition could strike like lightning into unprepared ground. As evening fell, the Argonauts found themselves in comfortable chambers that felt more like beautiful prisons. Food was indeed provided, rich dishes flavored with spices that burned pleasantly on the tongue. Wine flowed in cups of worked silver. Everything spoke of wealth and power and the casual certainty that these guests would never leave. Jason stood alone on a balcony overlooking darkened gardens, feeling the weight of impossible tasks settling across his shoulders. Somewhere beyond the city, the fleece hung in its grove, so close now that the journey's end seemed to mock him with proximity. He did not notice the figure watching from a neighboring tower, or the way her hands trembled as she pressed them against stone still warm from daylight. He did not know that in a chamber lit by a single lamp, A princess priestess was choosing between duty and desire, between her father's kingdom and a stranger's impossible dream. The night deepened. Stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed every chapter of this journey. Tomorrow would bring fire and earth and likely death. But tonight, while Jason prepared his heart for what seemed certain doom, Medea made a choice that would alter both their fates and prove that sometimes the most impossible tasks require not strength alone, but love offered from unexpected places. The palace gardens exhaled perfume into darkness, night-blooming flowers releasing scents that mingled strangely with smoke from distant braziers. Jason remained on the balcony long after his companions had retreated to their chambers, some to sleep, others to sharpen blades that would likely prove useless against bronze and fire. Below, shadows moved between carefully trimmed hedges where servants walked paths known only to those who tended them. He thought of Chiron's cave, that peaceful place where problems had solutions if one simply thought long enough. He thought of the river where he'd lost his sandal, helping an old woman who had been no old woman at all. Every step of this journey had seemed guided by something larger than chance, as if invisible hands had been arranging pieces on a board he could not see entire. Now those hands had placed him here, in a foreign palace, awaiting tasks designed to kill him. The irony tasted bitter as the wine still coating his tongue. A sound drew his attention, not loud, barely more than cloth brushing against stone, but distinct in the garden's stillness. A figure moved beneath his balcony, keeping to shadows cast by ornamental trees, female, from the way robes caught moonlight. She paused, face turning upward, and in that moment before clouds obscured the moon, he saw her clearly. Dark hair with silver threads woven through like starlight. Eyes that held something he recognized, though he had never met her before. The same look he'd seen in reflecting pools when contemplating paths from which there was no safe return. She gestured once, a motion toward the garden's eastern edge, where a gate stood barely visible in darkness. Then she was gone, dissolved into shadow like something from dream. Jason stood very still. This was obviously trap, the kind where foreign kings remove inconvenient guests through methods that leave no diplomatic complications. Send a beautiful woman, lure the hero into gardens, let guards finish what hospitality began. And yet something in that brief glimpse suggested not deception, but terrible risk freely chosen. He moved through the chamber where Orpheus lay with his lyre cradled like a child. Past the room where Castor and Pollux slept back to back as they had in their mother's womb. Down stone stairs worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, through corridors lined with bronze mirrors that reflected his passing like uncertain ghosts. The garden gate opened without sound, well-oiled hinges turning easily. Beyond lay a path of white stones that glowed faintly in starlight, leading between beds of flowers that grew in patterns suggesting sacred geometry. He followed because not following seemed impossible, though his hand rested on the knife at his belt. She waited beside a fountain where water fell in silver threads over carved stone. The basin held fish that moved like liquid shadows, scales catching occasional glimmers. She stood perfectly still, and he understood immediately that the stillness required enormous effort, like holding a pose against wind that threatened to push her elsewhere. "You should not have come," she said. Her voice carried the accent of this place, vowels shaped differently than Greek tongues shaped them, but the words themselves were clear. She had studied his language then, prepared for this meeting perhaps, or simply educated in the way of royal daughters expected to navigate foreign courts. Though I don't know why. Neither do I. The admission came like something forced past barriers of training and self-preservation. I am Medea, daughter of Aeaetes, priestess in the service of Hecate, who walks between worlds. I should not be here. I should not speak to you. Everything I was raised to honor and serve demands I let tomorrow's trials proceed without interference. She turned to face him fully, and he saw the war happening behind her eyes. The kind of internal battle that left no victors regardless of outcome. But I have dreamed of you for 3 nights running. The same dream each time. You standing before bronze bulls with flames licking across ground that will not yield. You falling, the fleece remaining forever where it hangs, and my father's kingdom continuing in its isolation until Helios himself grows cold in the sky. Dreams can deceive, Jason said, though he thought of Phineas and prophecies whispered in Thracian twilight. Not my dreams. I am priestess of the threshold goddess, trained to read what manifests in darkness. These visions are true. You will die tomorrow, unless... She stopped, teeth catching her lower lip. Unless you accept help that comes with prices you may not wish to pay. Jason watched water falling into the fountain's basin. An endless cycle of rising and returning. Somewhere in the city, guards walked their routes. Somewhere his companions slept or did not sleep, preparing minds for what morning would bring. Somewhere the Golden Fleece hung in its grove, impossibly distant, despite being merely 3 miles from where he stood. "What help can you offer?" he asked. From her robes she withdrew a small alabaster jar, stoppered with wax. Ointment made from herbs that grow only in Hecate's garden, prepared according to rituals I may not describe. Anoint yourself before dawn. Cover every part of your skin, leave nothing untouched. The bull's fire will not burn you, the earth will not resist your plow, and the warriors who spring from dragons' teeth, when they emerge, throw a stone among them before they can organize. They will turn on one another, seeing enemies where comrades stand. It is their nature to fight. Give them any target and they will take it. She held the jar extended, and he saw how her hand trembled despite the steadiness of her voice. To accept meant owing debt to someone he barely knew. To refuse meant certain death, the quest ending here in foreign soil far from home. Jason took the jar. His fingers brushed hers briefly, contact lasting no longer than a heartbeat, but feeling somehow weightier than any oath he'd ever sworn. "Why?" he asked. "Why betray your father's purpose?" Medea's expression shifted, pain and wonder mixing in equal measure. "I asked myself the same question. Perhaps because the gods have purposes beyond what kings intend. Perhaps because Hera, who has guided your journey from its beginning, whispers also in dreams of foreign priestesses. Or perhaps..." She paused, and when she continued, her voice had dropped to barely more than breath. "Perhaps because some recognitions transcend loyalty and reason both." She stepped back, distance opening between them like water flowing into spaces where stones had been removed. "Go now. Use the ointment as I've instructed. Survive tomorrow's trials. But know that in accepting my help, you bind us together in ways that will have consequences neither of us can yet imagine." "I understand," Jason said, though he suspected he understood nothing at all. "No," Medea replied, "you don't." "But you will." She moved past him, robes brushing against herbs planted beside the path. Her scent lingered briefly, something like myrrh mixed with the bitter tang of protection magic. Then she was gone, absorbed into the palace's labyrinthine darkness, leaving Jason alone beside the fountain with a jar of ointment and the sound of water endlessly falling and rising. He returned to his chamber without encountering guards or servants, as if invisible hands had cleared his path. The jar felt warm against his palm, though whether from his own heat or something dwelling in the ointment itself he could not determine. Dawn was perhaps 4 hours distant. Beyond the window, stars continued their slow procession, indifferent to mortal struggles playing out beneath their ancient light. Jason set the jar carefully on a table and lay down without sleeping, mind turning over everything Medea had said and not said. Help offered from unexpected places. Recognition that transcended reason. Consequences that stretched into futures neither could predict. Outside, night birds called from the gardens. The city slept. And in her chamber, Medea knelt before a shrine to Hecate, praying for forgiveness or guidance, or perhaps simply the strength to endure what her choice had set in motion. Dawn arrived slowly, as if reluctant to witness what it would bring. Jason rose before first light touched the palace walls, the alabaster jar cool now against his palm. His companions stirred in adjacent chambers, but he remained alone, methodically opening the wax seal. The scent that emerged was sharp and green, like crushed stems and mountain frost mixed with something older. Something that had no name in any language spoken by mortals. He followed Medea's instructions precisely. The ointment spread across his skin with strange ease, neither thick nor thin, absorbing almost immediately, yet leaving a faint shimmer like morning dew on grass. Arms first, then chest and back, legs and feet, finally face and neck. Every surface covered, nothing left untouched. The sensation was neither warm nor cold, but somewhere between, as if his skin had learned to exist at a different temperature than the surrounding air. When he finished, the jar was empty. He dressed in simple clothes, no armor that might conduct heat, and walked into corridors where servants were beginning their daily routines. They glanced at him but saw nothing unusual, just another foreigner preparing for whatever entertainments King Aeetes had devised. The trial ground lay outside the city walls. A field of black earth that had never yielded crop or flower. Wooden stands had been erected for spectators, already filling with Colchians curious to watch a stranger attempt the impossible. Guards stood at intervals, spears held loosely but ready. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off mist that clung to distant mountains. Jason's companions gathered near the field's edge. Orpheus touched his shoulder without speaking. Atalanta offered a nod that contained more confidence than Jason felt. The others arranged themselves in silent support, their presence worth more than any words they might have offered. King Aenetes arrived on a bronze chariot, his robes the color of dried blood, his crown catching sunlight like a threat. Beside him stood advisors and priests, their faces carefully neutral. Jason searched for Medea among them, but saw no sign of her presence. Perhaps she watched from some hidden vantage, or perhaps she could not bear to witness what her help had made possible. "The bulls await," Aeneas announced, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "Yoke them, if you possess the strength. Plow the field if you possess the courage. Plant the teeth if you possess the wisdom to survive what grows." 2 handlers led the creatures forth from iron pens. The bulls were massive, their hooves cast in bronze that rang against stone, their hides black as volcanic glass. When they breathed, flames curled from their nostrils, scorching the earth in small circles that smoldered and refused to fade. The heat radiating from their bodies made the air waver like water disturbed by wind. Jason walked forward. The crowd grew silent, even the wind seeming to pause. He approached the first bull slowly, not with the swagger of false confidence, but with the steady calm of someone who had already accepted whatever outcome awaited. The bull lowered its head. Flames intensifying, a gout of fire that should have consumed flesh and left only ash behind. Instead, the fire washed across Jason's ointment-covered skin and found no purchase. The protection held. The flames curled around him like water flowing around stone, seeking any exposed surface and finding none. Murmurs rippled through the watching crowd. Aeetes leaned forward, knuckles white against the chariot's rail. Jason grasped the yoke, bronze hot enough to melt ordinary flesh, and lifted it across the bull's massive shoulders. The creature bellowed, more in surprise than pain, fire erupting in all directions. But Jason held firm, securing the yoke with practiced hands, despite heat that turned the air itself into a shimmering dance. The second bull proved no different. Flames, fury, resistance, all meeting the invisible barrier that Medea's craft had woven. Within minutes, both bulls stood yoked together, still breathing fire but now bound to human purpose. The plow waited, iron-tipped and heavy, designed for earth that had defeated every previous attempt to break it. Jason guided the bulls forward, their bronze hooves striking sparks from stones buried in the black soil. The plow bit deep, turning earth that fell away in dark furrows. Releasing steam that carried the scent of things long buried. He plowed until noon, the sun reaching its highest point and beginning its slow descent. The field lay in neat rows, dark and ready. Sweat ran down Jason's face, mixing with the shimmer of protection, but his skin remained unmarked. Unblistered, bearing no sign of the flames that had sought repeatedly to consume him. Aeates descended from his chariot. A servant brought forth a leather bag that rattled when moved, the dragon's teeth Jason must now sew. Each tooth was long as a man's hand, yellowed with age, carved with symbols that predated written language. "Plant them," Aeates commanded, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Let us see if you survive the harvest." Jason took the bag and walked along the furrows, dropping teeth at intervals as one might plant any crop. They fell into dark earth and seemed to sink deeper than natural soil should allow, pulled down by whatever force waited beneath. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the earth began to tremble. Warriors emerged, not born but assembled, rising from soil with armor already strapped to bodies that had never known childhood. They came armed with swords and shields, their faces blank as unmarked stone, their movements synchronized as if controlled by a single mind. 10 warriors became 20, 20 became 40, each one turning eyeless faces toward Jason as if recognizing the one who had called them forth. Jason remembered Medea's instruction. A single stone thrown before they organized, before purpose coalesced into directed violence. He bent, found a rock half buried at the furrow's edge, and hurled it into the warrior's midst. The stone struck one warrior's shield with a ringing impact that echoed across the field. Immediately, the struck warrior turned on his nearest neighbor, sword already swinging. That warrior parried and counterattacked, striking a third. Within heartbeats, the entire company had turned on itself, each seeing enemies where moments before had stood allies. The battle was terrible and efficient. Swords met shields, spears found gaps in armor, warriors fell and did not rise. The Earthborn killed each other with the same emotionless precision that had characterized their emergence, following nature deeper than any loyalty or reason. When it ended, the field lay silent. Broken weapons and shattered armor marked where the warriors had stood. The earth slowly reclaimed what it had temporarily released, bodies sinking back into furrows that closed over them like water-accepting stones. Jason stood alone in the plowed field, breathing hard despite the ointment's protection. The shimmer on his skin was fading now, Medea's magic spent in the day's trials, but the trials themselves were complete. The crowd erupted, not in celebration, but in shock and uncertain murmuring. This foreigner had done what should have been impossible. The bulls stood yoked and docile. The field lay plowed and harrowed. The dragon-teeth warriors had destroyed themselves, leaving the stranger untouched. Aeates remained frozen on his chariot, face twisted between rage and the obligation of his word. He had promised the fleece to whoever completed the trials. But every part of him rebelled against honoring that promise. "You have completed the tasks," Aeates finally said, each word emerging as if pulled by force. "Return tomorrow. The fleece will be prepared for your taking." It was a lie. Jason heard it in the king's voice, saw it in how advisors leaned close to whisper urgent counsel. Tonight would bring treachery, an attempt to kill the Argonauts before any fleece could change hands. He walked from the field past spectators who parted like water before a ship's prow. His companions fell in around him, their presence a silent wall of support. They retreated to the palace as afternoon shadows lengthened across Colchis, bringing with them the first hints of evening cool. Back in his chamber, Jason finally allowed himself to breathe fully, deeply. His skin bore no mark from the day's fire, but he felt tired in ways that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. He had survived the impossible and won nothing but delay and the certainty of Aeates' betrayal. Twilight gathered beyond the window. Somewhere in the palace, Medea surely knew that her father would not honor his word. Somewhere in the sacred grove, the Golden Fleece hung waiting, guarded by a serpent that never slept. The quest stood poised on a knife's edge, balanced between completion and disaster. And the night ahead would determine which direction the balance fell. Night descended over Colchis like a hand closing around a secret. Jason watched from his window as torches bloomed throughout the palace grounds, small fires that did nothing to warm the darkness gathering in corners and beneath doorways. His companions had dispersed to their own quarters, Orpheus tuning his lyre with careful fingers, Atalanta checking her bowstring for the third time, each hero processing the day's trials in their own manner. The palace kitchen sent up dinner, lamb and flatbread arranged on bronze plates that gleamed in lamplight. Jason ate without tasting, his mind already moving beyond these walls toward the grove where the fleece waited. Every instinct cultivated under Chiron's patient teaching told him that Aeaches would strike tonight. Tomorrow's promised ceremony was performance meant to disguise assassination. A soft knock came at his door, different from a servant's efficient rap. This was hesitant, almost questioning. Jason opened it to find Medea standing in the corridor, wrapped in a dark cloak that made her nearly invisible against the shadowed stone. Her eyes held urgency and something else, a finality that spoke of bridges already burned. "My father's guards will come before dawn," she whispered, slipping inside. "He has ordered the Argo burned, the Argonauts killed in their sleep. His honor means nothing when weighed against his pride." Jason nodded slowly. He had expected this, but hearing confirmation still sent cold purpose through his chest. "Then we leave tonight." "The fleece first," Medea said. "It hangs in Ares' sacred grove 3 miles upriver. The serpent that guards it has never slept since the world was young. No sword can pierce its scales. No spear finds gaps in its coiling length." "Then how?" Jason asked, though he already suspected the answer. Medea drew a small vial from beneath her cloak. The liquid inside was dark as midnight water, swirling with its own internal current. Songs older than Colchis, words that even serpents must obey. But I must be the one to sing them. This magic answers only to those who have given everything to learn it. She was offering total betrayal of her home, her father, her country. For a foreign hero, she had known mere days. Jason understood the weight of what she carried, how it would mark the rest of her life like scars from invisible chains. "Your father will never forgive this," he said quietly. "I know." Her voice remained steady. "That knowledge lives in me like a second heartbeat. But I looked at you in that field today, surrounded by fire and earth-born warriors, and I understood that some choices are already made before we recognize them. The gods write certain fates in ink that cannot be washed away." Jason gathered his sword, his cloak, the sandals that had carried him down from Chiron's mountain. They moved through the palace like shadows learning to walk, avoiding torch-lit corridors, keeping to servant passages that Medea knew from childhood exploration. Twice they heard guards approaching and pressed themselves into alcoves, barely breathing until bronze-shod footsteps faded. They emerged into gardens where night-blooming flowers released scents both sweet and slightly poisonous. Beyond the palace walls, Colchis slept beneath a moon 3 days past full, its light turning the world to silver and shadow. Medea led them upriver along paths that wound through cypress groves and meadows where morning dew was already forming on grass. The Phasis murmured beside them, its voice a constant companion speaking in liquid syllables. An owl called from somewhere deep in the trees, its cry falling into silence like a stone into still water. The sacred grove announced itself gradually. First, a change in the air, a thickness that made breathing slightly more difficult. Then a shift in the darkness ahead, as if the shadows there were older, more intentional. Finally, they stood at the grove's edge, looking into a clearing where ancient oaks grew in a perfect circle around a single tree older than the rest. Upon that central oak, even in moonlight, the Golden Fleece shone. It hung from the lowest branch, heavy as gilt, bright as sunrise captured and held. The wool seemed to contain its own illumination, casting gentle gold across the clearing's floor. And coiled around the tree's base, scales gleaming like polished midnight, lay the serpent. Its body was thick as a man's torso, its length impossible to judge as coils disappeared into shadow and emerged again. The head rested on folded coils, eyes open, unblinking, pupils like vertical slashes in lamplight amber. Those eyes fixed immediately on the intruders. The serpent's head rose, tongue flickering out to taste the air for threat and intention. A low hiss emerged, not quite warning, not quite question. Medea stepped forward alone. She uncorked the vial and poured a single drop onto the earth, then began to sing. The language was older than Greek, older than any tongue Jason recognized. The words seemed to have textures rather than meanings, each syllable carrying weight that settled over the clearing like falling snow. The serpent's head swayed slightly, following the rhythm. Its eyes remained open, but something in their focus softened. Medea's voice rose and fell, weaving patterns in the air that Jason could almost see, could almost touch. The song spoke of sleep earned through long watching, rest deserved by those who guard faithfully, the comfort of finally closing eyes that had witnessed centuries pass. Gradually, impossibly, the serpent's eyes began to close. First one, then the other, lids descending like slow curtains. The great head lowered toward its coils, muscles relaxing in segments down the enormous length. The hiss faded to a sigh that sounded almost grateful. When the serpent lay fully motionless, breathing in deep rhythms that measured time in ages rather than moments, Medea gestured to Jason. He approached the tree carefully, respectfully, aware that he walked on ground sacred to gods he did not worship. The fleece was heavier than expected. It slid from the branch into his arms with weight that seemed more than physical, as if he now carried all the stories that had gathered around it, all the deaths it had caused, all the quests it had inspired. The wool felt warm, almost alive, and smelled of summer meadows and something indefinable. Perhaps the scent of pure wonder. They retreated from the grove slowly, not turning their backs until the cypress trees rose between them and that ancient clearing. Only then did they run, fleece bundled in Jason's arms. Medea's hand guiding him through darkness toward the river and the waiting Argo. The ship's crew had been roused by Argus, first among the Argonauts to sense approaching danger. They stood ready at the oars, provisions already loaded, mooring lines held but not yet released. Jason and Medea splashed through shallows and scrambled aboard as the first shouts rose from the distant palace. Torches appeared on the palace walls. More bloomed along the road. Aeetes had discovered the theft, or the fleeing, or both. "Row," Jason commanded, and 50 oars bit water in perfect unison. The Argo glided from shore like a dream releasing its hold, gathering speed as current caught her, as oars found their rhythm. As the sacred timber in her prow whispered encouragement in a voice like wind through Dodona's oak. Behind them, soldiers reached the river bank. Spears arced through moonlight and splashed harmlessly into the Argo's wake. Aeetes himself appeared, recognizable even at distance by his crown and his rage. His shouts carrying across water but arriving empty of power. The Argo sailed swift and true, bearing the fleece and the heroes and the princess who had traded everything for a stranger's quest. Colchis fell behind, becoming first a glow on the horizon, then a memory, then nothing but story. Jason stood at the stern, Golden Fleece still in his arms, watching the land of trials disappear. Medea stood beside him, her face unreadable in starlight. Neither spoke. Some moments hold too much for words. The journey home had begun, longer and stranger than the journey out, and the fleece's golden warmth against Jason's chest felt less like triumph and more like the weight of consequences yet to unfold. The Argo carried them through waters that grew stranger as dawn approached. The Phasis River widened, then narrowed, then opened into coastal shallows where reeds whispered secrets to passing currents. Behind them, Colchis had become less than memory, but the weight of what they carried pressed heavier than gold. Jason finally descended to the deck, laying the fleece carefully upon timber, specially prepared for its rest. Even in pre-dawn darkness, the wool held its impossible glow, casting gentle illumination across faces worn by flight and wonder. The Argonauts gathered around it silently, each reaching out to touch something they had sailed half the world to find. The fleece felt warm beneath their fingers. Impossibly soft, as if woven from solidified sunlight rather than any earthly ram's wool. Some claimed to hear faint music when they touched it. Others swore they felt courage flowing from the wool into their weary bodies. Orpheus, alone among them, drew his hand back quickly, eyes troubled by something he heard that his companions could not. Medea stood apart from the celebration, if celebration was the word for such quiet reverence. She leaned against the stern rail, watching the coastline slide past in shades of grey and darker grey. Jason joined her there, drawn by something in her stillness that spoke louder than the crew's murmured amazement. "You cannot return," he said softly. It was statement, not question. "No," she agreed. "The threshold was crossed when I entered that grove. Before that, perhaps, the moment I chose to see you rather than simply look." Her voice held no regret, but something deeper, more complex. Acceptance, maybe. Understanding of prices paid for transformations that could never be undone. The Argo sailed through waters turning pearl with approaching sunrise. Navigation homeward would prove longer than their outward journey, as Phineas had warned. They could not return through the Symplegades, those clashing rocks that had granted passage once and would grant it never again. Instead, they would find strange routes, rivers that flowed uphill, seas that changed color with the phase of moon, islands where time moved sideways rather than forward. But those adventures would unfold slowly, gently, like flowers opening to inevitable light. For now, the Argonauts rested at their oars, letting current carry them, letting wind fill the sail that Athena's hand had blessed. The sacred oak timber in the prow whispered prophecies too soft to hear clearly, speaking of journeys yet to come and prices yet to pay. Days folded into one another like waves, each distinct yet part of a continuous rhythm. They sailed past islands where voices called from shore, tempting them to land and rest forever. They navigated straits where water ran two different colors, clear boundary between them that ships crossed but could never fully understand. At night, stars wheeled overhead in patterns both familiar and subtly wrong, as if they traveled not just through space, but through layers of reality wearing thin. Medea stood watch often during those strange passages, her knowledge of hidden ways proving equal to any chart. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried certainty. "Turn here. Avoid that fog. Offer wine to these waters before crossing." The crew learned to trust her without question, recognizing wisdom that came from sources older than reason. Jason found himself standing beside her more often than necessity required. They spoke of small things, the texture of wind, the taste of salt air, the particular blue of water over deep trenches. Larger matters, consequences, futures, these remained unspoken between them. Too vast for words that would only diminish what they contained. The fleece remained wrapped in silk and linen, protected from sun and spray, but its presence colored everything. The Argonauts moved differently, knowing they carried what they had sought. Their voices held new tones, pride mixed with uncertainty, as if they had grasped something whose true nature they had not fully considered. Months passed in this manner, or perhaps only weeks. Time moved strangely on waters blessed and cursed in equal measure. They encountered other ships occasionally, traders who stared at the Argo with recognition and fear, fishermen who crossed themselves and turned away. The story of their quest had traveled faster than any vessel, becoming legend before they returned to prove it true. When at last they approached familiar waters, when Greek islands appeared on horizons and the stars resumed their proper patterns, the Argonauts felt both relief and something like loss. The strange, timeless quality of their journey was ending, delivering them back to a world governed by ordinary rules. Iolcus appeared on a morning wrapped in autumn mist. The city older than they remembered, somehow smaller. Word of their arrival spread before they docked, and crowds gathered at the harbor, silent and uncertain, as if witnessing a myth stepping from story into flesh. Jason carried the fleece ashore himself, its weight familiar now, comfortable. Pelias waited in the palace, older than seemed possible for the time they had been gone, eyes still sharp, but body bent beneath years that had accumulated, like interest on a debt long owed. The usurper king stared at the fleece, then at Jason, then at Medea, standing quiet and dangerous at the hero's shoulder. Something in Pelias's face shifted, fear replacing calculation, understanding arriving too late that some quests completed become curses for those who set them in motion. What followed unfolded as Medea planned. Though Jason would spend long years afterward wishing he had seen the pattern sooner, had understood the price his victory would exact from others. Justice came to Pelias, but justice wearing Medea's face proved terrible and absolute, leaving shadows that no ritual cleansing could fully erase. The fleece was dedicated to Zeus, hung in a temple built specially for its keeping. The Argo herself, too sacred now for ordinary voyaging, was drawn onto shore and given to Poseidon's care. She rested on sacred ground, prow pointing toward horizons she would never again pursue. Years passed as years do, measuring victories that tarnished and loves that curdled, until the great ship became simply part of landscape. Children playing around her weathered hull, old sailors gathering in her shadow to share stories of impossible quests and heroes who had been young when the world was different. On a particular afternoon, neither special nor ordinary, Jason came again to where the Argo rested. His hair had gone silver, his body marked by scars that told their own stories. He sat in the ship's shadow, running his palm along timber silvered by weather and time. The wood held warmth from afternoon sun, rough beneath his touch but familiar as his own skin. He closed his eyes, remembering when these oars had bent beneath strong backs, when this deck had rung with 50 voices raised in song, when the sacred oak had whispered prophecies that seemed to promise everything would be worth the cost. Whether it had been worth it, he no longer knew. The fleece still shone in its temple. Medea lived far away now. Their story ended in ways no quest could have prepared him for. The Argonauts had scattered to their separate fates, dying in battles or living into peaceful age, each carrying their own version of what their journey had meant. But the Argo remained. Patient and permanent, more enduring than the heroes who had sailed her. And sitting in her shadow, Jason felt something like peace, the kind that comes not from triumph but from completion, from having lived fully through a story even when its ending proved more complex than its beginning promised. If tales of ancient heroes and their long journeys through strange waters have accompanied you gently toward rest tonight, perhaps you will return again to Olympus' dreams, where other myths wait to unfold softly, carrying you safely into peaceful sleep. The tide murmured against the shore, eternal and unbothered, while overhead the first stars appeared. Patient and familiar, watching as they had always watched over heroes and their stories, brief and bright as summer lightning.